first start with the administrative issues. We have an agenda that's been distributed. Are there any comments, changes, additions, deletions to the agenda? And if not, any objections to following the agenda as distributed? Any objections? We see no hands up. We'll take the agenda in the order that it was distributed. The proceedings from February 2019 have been distributed with the meeting packet. Any comments on the proceedings? If you want to comment, please raise your hand. I see no hands up. Any objections to approving those proceedings as distributed? And there are no hands up, so the proceedings stand approved. We afford the public an opportunity to comment, and this is the time. If you got a comment, it's supposed to be for the purpose of commenting on items that are not on the agenda, and we'd ask that you keep your comments brief. Any members of the public with a hand up? I can see none. And Tony, if you see someone with a hand up, please interrupt me and we'll call on them. So there are no members of the public with a hand up, so I'll take the next item on the agenda, which is a review of the 2020 assessment updates for the Gulf Maine and Southern New England flounder stock. We have two presentations. I think I'll start with the first one, which is Paul.
Okay, you guys see my screen?
Right now it's just in the, yeah, now we're in presenter mode. Thanks, Paul.
Good. Great. Okay, so this is going to be a summary of the Gulf of Maine Winter Flounder Management Track Assessment, which was recently reviewed in September, mid-September. This was a level 2 assessment, a level 2 review. The last assessment was in 2017, the 2017 operational assessment. This assessment is a 30+ centimeter survey area swept assessment. There's no analytical model for this stock. Just to let people know, there's more information on the data portal at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center webpage. There's a document on there that has tables and figures if people are interested in more of the gory details in this. As I said, this is a 30 centimeter area swept assessment. It was developed as a Plan B in SARC 52 in 2011. It's been updated several times in 2014, 15, and 2017. So this was the first area swept assessment for groundfish. So there's a little bit of history with this one. For stock status, it has not changed. Overfish status is unknown, and overfishing is not occurring. This stock is not in a rebuilding plan. It was never declared overfished. Give you a little history on this assessment. In GARM 3 and at SARC 52, the analytical models did not pass review. We tried many different models. However, all the models have severe retrospective issues. Basically there's a conflict between the large change, the large reduction in catch over the time series with little change in the survey indices and or the size structure, in the commercial removals and also in the surveys. So we're now basing this assessment on just the survey area swept direct estimate of biomass from the surveys. Just to remind people, this is the Gulf of Maine stock, which was historically the smallest of the 3 winter flounder stocks north of Cape Cod. Almost all of the catch comes out of stat area 514, coming out of like Mass Bay, Cape Cod Bay, Stellwagen Bank. So almost all the removals are coming from that small area. So for this assessment, we update the raw survey indices for the Northeast Fishery Science Center, Mass DMF, and the Maine Hampshire survey. We estimate the 30-plus area swept biomass from 2009 to 2019. This is done using non-overlapping strata between those 3 surveys. And we updated the catch from 2009 to 2019 for the commercial and recreational landings and discards. Here are the landings trend since the 1980s. You can see there's been a large decline in the landings over the time period. The landings in 2019 was at a record low for this stock. On the bottom is just the proportional makeup of the market categories in the commercial landings, and you can see there really isn't that much of a change in the market category makeup, which is part of the reason why the models have some difficulty, since there isn't a lot of dynamics in the change in the size of fish coming out of the removals. Here's a breakdown of the total catch. For this assessment, we updated the recreational estimates using the new calibration coming out of MRIP. That's changed the perception a little bit for this stock. Those recreational estimates pretty much have doubled. Most of the recreational removals were in the 1980s. You can see now with those new estimates, the recreational component is actually larger than the commercial component during that time period. However, starting in the early 90s, the recreational catch decreased to very low levels since then. Those numbers still doubled, but there's just doubling of a very small number, so it's not as dramatic. The commercial removals just continually to decline to a point now where in 2019 we have a record low catch for Gulf of Maine winter flounder. I think it was around 109 metric tons. Here's just a comparison between the new and old MRIP estimates. On top of the landings, you can see how those estimates on average doubled in size with the new calibration. On the bottom, the B2s also have a pretty big change. However, keep in mind that the B2s are a very small component of the recreational removals, given this 15% mortality rate on the discards. This plot just shows the combined effect with landings and B2s added together. Same sort of story as before. And here are the raw survey indices on top of the Northeast Fishery Science Center bottom trawl survey. In the middle is the Mass DMF survey, spring and fall, and on the bottom is the Maine New Hampshire survey. And in general, you can see these trends are fairly flat over the time period. From the 1980s to now, they continually catch about the same, on average, about the same amount of fish. So this assessment now is based on the survey area swept. We don't have a survey that covers the entire stock, so we use 3 different surveys with non-overlapping strata to hopefully cover the whole stock as best as we could. This table shows the breakdown of each survey contributing to that total estimate. On the top row is the survey area in nautical square miles. The Mass DMF survey in the middle is the smallest area-wise. However, that survey is important for winter flounder. They catch a large amount of fish in that small area. The Maine, New Hampshire survey catches a lot of fish and is a large area. However, most of the fish in that survey are smaller than 30 centimeters, so it doesn't contribute as much. The next row is just the toe footprint, the assumed footprint for each toe on the wing spread. And then the expansion factor is just the total area divided by that footprint. Here's the length frequencies coming out of the Maine, New Hampshire survey. And as you can see, there's the numbers drop off very quickly when you get up to 30 centimeters, and there's not as many those larger fish caught in that survey. So for new sources of information that went into this assessment, we had more tow data from the twin trawl experiment, the efficiency experiment, and Tim Miller was kind enough to update the estimates of efficiency using new model and increase sample size. That work is summarized in the working paper on the data portal. We also updated the MRIP recreational catch. However, just keep in mind that this assessment now is 100% survey-based, so those estimates don't really affect the assessment. The only thing they can affect is whether the stock is overfishing or not, but that has not changed. So this is the basic equation for the exploitable biomass. We're calling exploitable biomass 30 plus centimeter biomass index per toe, multiplied by this expansion factor, which is the total survey area divided by the toe footprint times Q. Q, in this case, you can think of Q as the efficiency of the survey gear between the wing spread. It's an important assumption for the exploitable biomass, and the exploitable biomass is pretty sensitive to this assumption. So the exploitation rate is then just simply the catch over this 30 centimeter biomass estimate. The biological reference points were based on F40 from a length-based yield per recruit model with the same 30 centimeter knife edge selectivity pattern. These are the inputs that went into the yield per recruit back at SAR 52. It's using the same M and that 30 centimeter selectivity, and the long-term growth goes into this estimate. So using many years of age data go into that estimate. So these are the plots that Tim produced on the efficiency. He accounted for day-night effects and also length effects in the estimates. On the left is the efficiency during the day. Keep in mind we're only using 30 plus centimeter cutoff here. During the day, there's a bigger difference in efficiency between the Bigelow gear and this more efficient flat net used during the experiment. However, at night, there wasn't really that much of a difference between the two gear types. So out of Tim's work, he accounts for specific tow, day, night effects, and length effects, and comes up with these implied efficiencies coming out of the survey for each year and each survey. So we basically took the average efficiencies over this time period as an estimate of Q to go into our calculations of area swept. And this is what was updated in this assessment. So to give you some history on how the Q changed in this assessment, back at SARC 52, there wasn't any information really on what the efficiency should be. So the review panel at SARC 52 came to this conclusion of assuming a Q of 0.6. At that time, we presented a range of different Qs and the effects on the assessment. In 2017, we had some experimental data from the sweep study. That work at the time estimated a Q of 0.866. However, the sample size was a little bit low at that point. That Q increased from 0.6, so when the Q increases, the biomass estimate decreases. So for this update, we have some more information, and the Q estimate for this update went down to 0.71. So it's a little bit of a decrease in the Q, so that will increase the biomass estimate coming out of this method. Here's the estimates, the total estimates of 30 plus biomass from the spring and fall survey. On the top's the spring survey, and the colors on the bars represent the amount of fish in each survey. In the spring, you can see that there's a greater proportion of the stock within the state surveys, which makes sense. In the spring, the fish are more inshore, spawning in the shallows. So there's a greater proportion in the state surveys. In the fall, there's a greater proportion in the Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey. Now, in the past, we used the fall survey as the estimate because there was some concern that we're missing fish in the spring, with some fish being inside the estuaries where there's no survey conducted. However, as we update this assessment, the estimates between the spring and the fall are very similar at this point. However, we're still using the fall survey because we have some estimates of the efficiency of the gear for the center survey, where we don't have any experiments on the state surveys. So we're basically just using the same Q for the state survey gear, even though that gear is quite a bit different than the center gear. So there's a little more uncertainty in the spring estimates because a greater proportion is in the state surveys where we don't have that information on efficiency. So we're still using the fall survey for the catch advice. However, it doesn't really matter that much because the two surveys are producing very similar results. Here are the exploitation rates coming out of the two surveys, and they're pretty much lined up pretty well. The exploitation has been low over the entire Bigelow time series, far below the overfishing definition of 0.23. One of the sources of concern is this decreasing biomass, from the beginning of the time series under these low exploitation rates, which doesn't really follow what you would expect out of the population dynamics. That can also be seen in these plots. On the left is the biomass trend. You see that declining trend in the biomass under the low exploitation rates on the right. So one of the changes going forward coming out of this review, the review has suggested using 2 years of information to inform the catch advice. In the past, we always used the terminal year for the 3 surveys. That basically results in ignoring every other year. So to stabilize the catch advice, we're now using a 2-year average, using all the new information every time the assessment is updated going forward. It doesn't really have a huge effect, but it should stabilize the catch advice going forward. As seen in this plot, you can compare the 2-year average point estimates versus the annual estimates coming out of the fall survey. So the ABCs for the stock are basically calculated as 75% of the exploitation rate at 40%, multiplied by this 30 plus area swept biomass estimate. At this point, we're using the average of 2 fall surveys for that estimate. So for sources of uncertainty, as I said, the biomass and exploitation rates are sensitive to the Q assumption. We do have some more information on that with this assessment. That should improve things a little bit. However, we don't have any information on the efficiency of the state surveys, so that still remains a source of uncertainty. And as a general concern, there's still some concern with very low exploitation rates and little response to the biomass or the indices for the stock. Why that it's occurring is not really known. The other concern with this method is we don't have a biomass status coming out of this method. And that's the end of my little summary. I can take any questions.
Questions for Paul? Any hands? You want to ask a question, please put up your hand. You have no hands up, at least that I can see. Tony, do you see any hands up?
I do not, David.
Okay, so Paul, let me just ask a question in regards rebuilding. I mean, you just expressed the point that I was going to make, and is it possible to increase this population, or is this a case where we have environmental drivers that are pretty much determining what the status of biomass is? I mean, are there ways we could rebuild this?
It's not really clear why the catch keeps going down, but there's no real, it doesn't seem to affect the survey trends. You don't really see an effect on the size structure. That has remained constant since the 1980s overall for this stock. Now that's not true for the Southern England stock. This stock was never put into a building plan. It was never declared overfished. So there's really, there's no mandate to rebuild the stock. However, we don't really have a biomass target out of this method. So it's kind of a big unknown.
Okay, thank you. Oh, excuse me.
So one of the one of the things that you hear, there's conflicting trends between the recreational fishing, the commercial fishing, and how well the stock's doing. One of the things that could be occurring, just a guess at this point, is that perhaps in the 1980s, more of the stock was in shallower water, whereas now, if there was a shift into deeper water, that would explain why the survey trends have remained fairly constant whereas there's a bigger decline, you know, inside the estuaries where we don't really have any information.
Okay, thank you. I've got Dan McKernan.
Yeah, thank you, David. I have two questions for Paul. First, what is the workload associated with conducting an efficiency study for the state trawl surveys? And the second one, I would ask Paul to comment on the problems that are going to be created by this year's cancellation of the trawl surveys and with an unknown restarting time for those surveys. So what's the workload associated with these efficiency studies, and comment on the lack of trawl surveys this year?
It's a pretty good workload for the efficiency studies. Basically, you need all this work was done on the twin trawl, so you need a specialized whether you can tow two nets at the same time. So if this work would be done, probably that you need a specific vessel for that, and instead of using the Bigelow net, you would use the state survey net to compare to the, you know, the industry standard for the most efficient gear that they use, you know. But you need a good amount of tows within an area where you have pretty good catch rates for winter flounder. In terms of going forward with next year, if we don't have any surveys, I mean, I guess we lose some information here. I guess we can't use an average. We're back to using a single year for the catch advice. I mean, it causes some uncertainty, but we just can use the information we got going forward.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? If not, we'll move on to the Southern New England stock. Okay, so let's do that. Move on to the Southern New England stock. Next presentation is by Ms. Ward.
Do I have to give up control, or?
Is everyone able to see my screen currently?
Yes.
Which screen? The correct screen, does it have the presentation up on it?
It has the presentation, but not in the presentation mode, just like the mode that it would be in for editing. Now it's in presentation mode.
How's that? Okay.
That looks good. And
Great. So I'm going to give a quick run through, just like Paul did, of the Southern New England Winter Flounder assessment. Again, as Paul mentioned, the full details can be found on our data portal, along with tables and figures and model files, as well as some working papers that will provide a lot of information to some questions that you might have. So this stock was last assessed in 2017 with a statistical catch at age model. The reference points at the time were FMSY reference points with an FMSY of 0.34 and an SSBMSY of about 25,000 metric tons. The stock status was overfished, but overfishing was not occurring. The first term of reference from this assessment was to estimate catch from all sources. This model uses commercial landings, commercial discards, recreational landings, and recreational discards. For the purpose of this update, we used the new calibrated MRIP estimates for the recreational information. And all these sources of data are compiled into a single fleet to be input into the model. For commercial landings in 2019, almost the lowest in the time series. If we ignore the years of moratorium in the late 2000 or around 2010, we're at the lowest in the time series. Landings were 202 metric tons. for 2019. Discards were 105 metric tons, well below the time series average. Recreational landings were at a time series low as well. 500 kilograms were recreational landings. So recreational landings have basically fallen off of a cliff for this stock and have remained low since about 2000, or all throughout the 2000s. Represented in red here are the old MRIP numbers, and the blue shows how that the new MRIP calibration scaled up both landings and discards in the next plot. Very similar to how it was pictured in Gulf of Maine. The 2019 recreational discards were 2.4 metric tons. Again, well below the time series average. And presenting that in a total catch, looking at total catch using old MRIP numbers and the new MRIP calibrated data that actually went into this assessment update. So the 2019 total catch was 310 metric tons. Total catch components, you can see that recreational landings have fallen off drastically. Almost 98% is commercial data now going into this assessment. The next term of reference was to evaluate the indices. There's now 12 indices that go into this assessment, some regional indices, some state-specific indices, and a couple of Young of the Year indices. So we have 3 Science Center surveys. For this update, we have brought in the NEMAP Spring Survey. We also have spring surveys from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, 2 surveys from New Jersey and 1 from the University of Rhode Island, as well as 2 Young of the Year surveys from Massachusetts and Connecticut. The next few slots are going to be scaled indices. The first slide here is the 4 regional survey indices. That would be the 3 Science Center surveys and the NEMAP Spring Survey. And they all show a fairly similar decline starting at about 2000 down to present. And we see a similar thing in all the state surveys. I know the plot gets messy, but if you squint, you can see over the entire time series a general decline for all these surveys, down to almost time series low values for every survey in the present year, or in 2019. And then finally, the 2 Young of the Year surveys. Massachusetts is pretty flat over the time series, and other than a couple of peaks for Connecticut, we also see somewhat of a decline from late 90s, 2000 to 2019. So that covers the fishery dependent and independent data that went into the assessment. The biological data is carried over from the benchmark in 2011 at SARC 52. We assume a constant M of 0.3. Maturity information from 1982 to 2008 from the Massachusetts Spring Survey was used. And these input values were retained for this 2020 operational. Now the meat of the assessment comes in this term of reference 3. This is actually run the model and get the model estimates and include any bridge runs. Now we're kind of limited by what we can do for these operational assessments, but this assessment was a level 3, so I was able to make quite a few changes. And most of the changes that I made were spurred on by comments from the New England Fishery Management Council, SSC. So in 2017, the operational model configuration was the same as the model used from SARC 52. It was a single fleet that included commercial and recreational landings and discards. with 2 selectivity blocks, 11 survey indices, and a bunch of penalties. Most of these penalties were actually unnecessary as they weren't turned on the objective function. So for one of the steps here in my model bridge, I turned those off, and I'll get to that. So to build a bridge from the SARC-52 model to our current assessment model, I started with a continuity run and updated that through 2017, since the 2017 update only included data through 2016. Then I switched that model over to new MRIP calibrated data and updated that through 2019 and turned off or removed the needless penalties, and that had no effect on the model estimates. Moving on to the next step, these are the changes that were recommended by the SSC at the last panel review, and that was to include a new selectivity block. I chose from 2010 to present to try and get some even temporal resolution in these selectivity blocks, and also to include a flat top fleet selectivity as opposed to estimating selectivity at age, and this was to get rid of some cryptic biomasses showing up in the model. And then the final thing was to add the new NEMAP survey. So that brought us to a final model with a single fleet using commercial and recreational landings and discards, 3 selectivity blocks with flat top selectivity as opposed to selectivity at age, 12 survey indices, and a single penalty to start off the model with numbers at year 1. I'm not going to get into very much, if any, of the model diagnostics. Again, they're all presented in the full presentation that I presented to the review panel. They're all available on our portal, and I believe they were made available to the board. You can see that adding a third selectivity block or having any selectivity blocks at all doesn't really have that much of an impact. The flat top selectivity is pretty similar between each of the 3 time periods chosen. 2019 biomass estimates. Total biomass was estimated at about 5,200 metric tons, with SSB at about 3,700 metric tons. F was was at the lowest of the time series at a value of 0.077. And recruitment has remained pretty low throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Current estimate is 3.3 million fish. Not quite the lowest in the time series. The retrospective bias has increased a bit, and I feel like it's mostly a result of forcing that flat top on the fleet selectivity, although the patterns are still considered minor for F and SSB, so we didn't make any retrospective adjustments when it came to determining stock status. Moving on to term of reference 4 was to re-estimate or update the reference points. Previous reference points, again coming out of methodology developed at SARC-52, were based on a Beverton-Holt stock-recruit relationship. The SSC felt that these were providing recruitment estimates that were unrealistic given the current recruitment regime that we seem to be in. So we moved away from using this Beverton-Holt stock-recruit relationship and went to proxy reference points. So previously the stock was overfished, but overfishing was not occurring, and reference points were based on a stock-recruit relationship. Here's a plot showing the stock-recruit relationship. It's based on a fixed steepness, and it's probably not the best model to fit to these data. It almost appears that for southern New England there's a linear relationship in the stock-recruit data. So again, we moved away from that for this assessment to develop reference points. Using SPR-based reference points, F40% came in at 0.284 compared to 0.26, which is what it would have been if we used the old methodology. The spawning stock biomass reference point at 12,000 metric tons. Currently sit at 27% of the F threshold, 30% of the target, and 60% of the SSB threshold. So the stock remains in the same status. We're currently overfished, but overfishing is not occurring, and there was a minor retrospective bias, so no adjustment was made. Some of the sources of uncertainty carry over from SARC 52. We have a fixed natural mortality based on longevity equations. Recreational discard length information is pretty bad. And we do have a retrospective bias that is bordering on a major retrospective. So we might have to make adjustments going forward. And then some research needs just listed from panelist comments over the years, additional studies on maximum age, incorporating new information on maturity, looking at migration rates between stocks and additional investigations into substock structure, and incorporating environmental influence on a stock recruit relationship. Some of these have been looked at, some of them are ongoing. And there's been recent publications for a couple of these. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
All right, questions for Tony? I've got Connor McManus, Dr. McManus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Tony, for your presentation. I was just curious on your last bullet, and some of the research as of late has shown environmentally explicit relations with stock recruit dynamics, and I was just curious, has the Winter Flounder Working Group or yourself thought or discussed about future plans to include that work and how it might improve or change our perceptions on projections?
Yeah, so the Bell et al. Paper in 2018 is a starting point really for this work going forward. Rich Bell and I have updated that work, and we did have a working paper. I'm not sure if it was provided to the board or not, but I would encourage you to look at that working paper. And you'll see where the current status of that work is, and we are exploring different model types going forward to actually include that in the assessment model. But for this process and for this assessment, we're kind of handcuffed by what we were allowed and what we weren't allowed to change. And one of the things we aren't allowed to change is the model type. And in order to incorporate that kind of information, we need to switch to a different model. So it's on the forefront of what we're working on and what we're working towards. But until we have a research track or until another publication comes out with a new assessment model, we're not going to be able to include that assessment model to provide management advice.
Thank you. And just to follow up, is there plans for a research track assessment for Southern New England Winter Flounder?
It's not currently on the schedule, and I can't speak to whether that will change or not. There was some blowback at the SSC meeting that this environmental model isn't being considered since it does exist. But again, we're handcuffed by the process, and I don't know. I think the next possibility for winter flounder to be on the research track is 2026.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Connor. Megan Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question. I was looking at the meeting materials, the assessment overview that was provided. My sense is the stock biomass isn't great and potentially at its lowest level, but I saw that the catch projections were pretty high, and I was just wondering how that, I'm trying to grapple how those two things work together. I didn't know if that was a result of recruitment assumptions or how those projections are so high.
It is a result of recruitment assumptions. While we moved away from using the stock recruit relationship and the projections, we still are using the entire time series, the entire time series of empirical recruitment. And the projections are basically pulling a median from those values, which is still well above the recruitments that are being realized. But again, we're not only limited by what we can change through the assessment process, but I kind of wanted to stay away from making that many changes for a level 3 assessment. I made a lot of changes as it was, so I didn't really want to change the recruitment stanza that was going into the projections. The resulting change in the type of recruitment estimates going into the projections did bring down the SSB reference point quite a bit. And if we limit the recruitment stanza to say the last 10, 15 or 20 years, it does bring down those projections quite a bit as well. Now, Paul can probably speak better to this, but I believe at the recent SSC meeting, they've done what they did in previous years and used the 3-year average catch as opposed to using the projections for management advice. For the reason that you just brought up.
Any other questions? No hands up. Tony, you raised the issue of the bell paper, and I just note, I guess this is a question to the staff. In the minutes of the last meeting of the discussion, Doug Grout, myself, and others had talked about the bell paper and the need to have the PDT review it. So could the staff comment, did that take place, or is it a work in progress?
Hi, this is Dustin, just chiming in here. A decision was made to discuss this at the NRCC level, so I'm wondering if Tony Kearns would like to comment on progress there.
I think this conversation will continue at the NRCC. It was our understanding that the ballot paper would be worked into the assessment from conversations that we had at the NRCC. I understand from Tony Wood's perspective that they were bound by the constraints of the management track assessment, and I think that just wasn't communicated well during the NRCC meeting, so we'll have to talk about this more and continue on the conversation, and we can bring it back up at the next board meeting, David.
All right, thanks, Tony. Any other questions?
David,
Yes?
Paul Nitschke asked to be recognized to speak to that point.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, with the bell paper, like Tony said, it can be addressed through a research track unless the rules are changed for the management track, right? So Tony's working on that work, but until the rules change, it can't really be addressed through a management track. The other question about the projections, Tony's correct. The SSC basically went with this average catch approach. The main reason is because this stock is still in a rebuilding plan, and it wasn't deemed appropriate to put a big increase in the catch advice if it can't rebuild by the end date. So those projections, like was said, are pretty high compared to recent catches. So there's some concern with that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Comments? So that's the piece of continuing work that'll we'll no doubt get a report on at the next meeting. So are there any other questions on either one of these reports? And if not, I'm going to move on. No hands up. So next item of business is to elect a vice chairman of the committee. Do I have any nomination? Tony?
There is a nomination. David, I just thought we had someone to make it.
Yeah, David, I don't know if you recall, we discussed a potential candidate leading up to this meeting, and is it inappropriate for the chair to provide the nomination?
It's totally fine to do so.
Yeah, we would prefer to have somebody on the board provide the nomination.
Mr. Chairman, Megan Ware has one.
Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A vision has come to me, and I will nominate Bill Hyatt as vice chair.
Okay, do we have a second?
Cherie Patterson seconds.
Any comments on the motion? Any objections to the motion? Motion stands approved as suggested. Any other business to come before the committee? If not, meeting stands adjourned, and I'll turn it back over to Tony.